I live with my two daughters, Bethany and Kendall, in a cottage that I always thought was perfect. We built it 5 years ago, a bit out of town, in a rural area. My daughters were growing up too attached to their cell phones, so connecting them with nature, even if they had their cell phones, would be good for them. They put up some resistance at first, but after a while, they started to like it. It was just us, the clean air, the clear sky, and the sound of animals in the barn nearby. From the first day, everything had been ideal. The girls went to school in the nearest town about a 15-minute drive away, and I worked from home as an engineer. Bethany, the oldest, was already 14 and Kendall was barely 12. The country seemed like the perfect place. I liked to go out in the evenings to walk in the yard or the small woods that surrounded the property. The stars seemed brighter there, and all the land was mine. It was my refuge. No one bothered us, and the town people were also very resourceful. But even though they all had large, remote houses, they were all quite friendly, though they preferred not to interact too much. However, that tranquility was to be shattered in a way I could have never imagined. One night, everything changed. It was the beginning of something that would shake me out of that bubble of peace I had built for myself. One night, I would learn the hard way that no matter how safe a place may seem, we will never be completely safe. It was just another night. One of those nights when I like to come up for air. I was sitting on the porch, drinking a beer, when I heard a noise. I didn't pay much attention to it at first. In the field, there are always animals moving around. But this sound was different. It didn't sound like the footsteps of a deer or the hooting of an owl. It was dull, metallic clattering as if someone was dragging something across the yard floor. I got up from my chair and walked a few steps towards the source of the sound, but saw nothing. The moon barely illuminated the garden, and the shadows of the trees distorted the vision. I decided to walk to the barn, thinking that maybe something had gone in there. However, when I arrived, the animals were quiet. The cows were ruminating, and the horses were not even up. Everything seemed in order. I returned to the house confused. The noise was still on my mind, but I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was anything, maybe the wind or a fallen branch, and returned to my chair on the porch. Maybe I had had a few too many beers and was paranoid. It was time to go back to the house and go to sleep. Some nights they were louder than others, and even though I went out to check, I never found anything. Everything seemed fine, but that sound was driving me crazy. One night, Kendall's scream brought me out of bed like a spring. I ran to her room, but the door was locked. I tried to open it, but it was stuck. My daughter's screams were making me desperate, so I backed up a few steps and kicked it down. I found her on the floor, pale-faced and wild-eyed, staring at the window. What I saw next chilled my blood. A figure, a silhouette, was slinking through the open window. I caught a glimpse of a pair of legs disappearing into the darkness before it vanished completely. I ran to the window, but when I looked outside, there was no one there. The darkness of the field had swallowed everything. I hugged Kendall, who wouldn't stop shaking, and called the police. They arrived quickly but found no one. No footprints, no sign of forced entry, nothing. It was as if that person had vanished into thin air. Bethany, who had heard the screams, was also terrified. Both girls told me they wanted to go back to town, but I reassured them as best I could. Kendall told me that the man had tried to grab her and that he wanted to take her with him. I didn't know what to do with that information, other than to make sure everything was locked up and under control. After that night, I didn't want to take any more chances. The first thing I did was install cameras everywhere. I covered the garden, the porch, the barn, and the bedroom windows. If anyone came near me again, I would see them. I couldn't sleep peacefully knowing that something or someone had tried to break into my house. I felt a constant pressure in my chest, an anxiety that consumed me. The day after the cameras were installed, I decided that I was going to buy a gun the next day. It wasn't something I wanted to have in the house, especially for the girls, but I felt I no longer had a choice. Something strange was going on, and I wasn't going to wait for it to happen again. I had to be prepared to defend my daughters if necessary. The feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. Even during the day when everything seemed calm, something didn't fit. It was as if An invisible presence was there, lurking, waiting for the right moment. The nights were worse. I couldn't stop looking at the cameras, checking every nook and cranny for anything out of the ordinary. I had no idea that before nightfall came, before I had time to buy a gun, everything would explode. I was awakened from my nap by a thunderous noise. This time, it wasn't just a distant sound. Something was banging loudly outside, and my first instinct was to run to the camera screen. What I saw transfixed me. A man was outside, right in the front yard, hitting my truck with a shovel. Each blow echoed in the stillness of the night, and the metal of the truck creaked under the force of the impacts. His face looked good, not making the slightest effort to hide his face. I wasted no time. I woke Bethany and Kendall, telling them to jump out of their bedroom window and run to the barn to hide. I yelled at them not to come out until everything was safe. I had barely finished talking when I heard banging on the front door. The guy was trying to get in, and he was doing it with the same shovel he had smashed the truck's glass with. I called the police again, but every second that passed, the door gave way more. I ran to the door, trying to stop this man from entering. If he came into this house and somehow hurt me, he would soon go to the barn and attack my daughters. I could not allow that. The last blow blew a big hole in the door, and I watched as the shovel got stuck in the frame. That was my chance. I grabbed the shovel and with enormous force pulled and snatched it away from him. The guy fell to the ground. He wasn't expecting it. At that moment, I got my first good look at him. Without the shovel, he looked like a harmless man. He looked changed from absolute anger to total submission. But I didn't hesitate long. With the shovel in my hands, I lunged at him. I hit him with all my might. He tried to resist, but he was stunned. I don't know how many blows I gave him before he gave up, before he lay on the ground motionless. When the police arrived, it was all over. They arrested him and took him away without him saying a word. The nightmare was over. I never knew how that man had managed to get so close without the alarms going off. If I hadn't set up the cameras, we would have never realized that the man was attacking the van. When the man would have come to my door, I would have been caught off guard and might not have been as lucky as I was. The next few weeks were hell. My daughters didn't want to go back to the house, and frankly, neither did I. The police told me that the man had come to my house. The police told me that this man had escaped from a psychiatric institution, but it was never clear what he really wanted. In the first instance, he tried to rob us, but he never took anything. During this time, I speculated many things. Maybe he wanted to kidnap my daughter. Maybe he wanted to steal everything from us and leave, or even take the house. Whatever his motive was, one thing is for sure. To accomplish his goal, this person was probably going to have to kill us.
My story begins on a Saturday night. The only thing I remember is that, out of nowhere, I woke up in the dark. I didn't know what time it was, but something had pulled me out of my sleep. It could have been anything. A bad dream, some distant sound, or maybe just the discomfort of the bed that was about to change. I looked at the clock, but it was off. Great. There was a power outage. The silence in the house was deafening. So it was surely the wee hours of the morning. I lay there for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, trying to decide whether to get up or not. I tossed and turned a couple of times, trying to go back to sleep, but something wouldn't let me. I usually sleep very deeply. What on earth could have woken me up like that? I kept thinking about it, and I couldn't fall back asleep. And then I heard it. A soft noise, almost imperceptible, but clear enough to startle me. It was coming from downstairs. At first, I thought maybe it was the refrigerator or some plumbing, but the noise continued. It was like a drag, something heavy moving across the floor. I got out of bed quickly. I didn't want to make any noise just in case. My house wasn't big, but in the dark, any space could become a labyrinth. My heart was pounding in my chest as I tried to sharpen my ears. I followed the sound, which had now become clearer and more disturbing. Something was in my house, and it wasn't a faulty machine. As I descended the stairs, my whole body tensed. Each step creaked under my feet, even though I tried to move slowly. I didn't turn on the lights. They wouldn't work anyway. The noise continued. What scared me about it was really very low. Nothing and nobody makes that little noise, unless it was on purpose. Unless someone was trying to make as little noise as possible. As I reached the bottom floor, I stopped. My eyes were slow to adjust to the gloom, and in that blackness, I heard something else. A slight gasp, low, almost inaudible. I was not alone. My first instinct was to run back upstairs, but I stopped myself. If there was something down here, I had to see what it was. If I went up to my room, I would be in trouble. My doors were unlocked and my windows were barred. To go back to my room would be to corner myself. Besides, I wouldn't allow some teenager who wanted to take advantage of the power outage to steal my belongings. I took a few steps towards the dining room, and then I saw it. At first, it was just a dark shape, a lump on the floor. It was moving, but so slowly that I barely noticed it. I blinked, and my eyes finally adjusted to the darkness. I saw it clearly. It was a man, a stranger. He was crawling across the floor as if trying not to make a sound. He was holding a knife in his mouth, clenched between his teeth, as if ready to strike at any moment. I froze for a second, trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't some teenager trying to steal something from me and leave. This person was terrifying. Almost at the same time I saw him, he saw me too. As our gazes met, my body reacted before my mind did. I let out a gasp, instinctively recoiling. I asked aloud, unable to control my trembling tone. "Who the hell are you? Get out of my house, now!" The guy dropped the knife from his mouth and grabbed it with one hand. His gaze hardened, and without a word, he jumped up. This person didn't look like he had any intention of leaving. I watched him run. My first thought was that he was running away. I felt immediate relief, thinking that the threat was leaving with him. But something didn't add up. He didn't run for the back door, the same one he had entered through. He veered into the hallway, into the house. I stood, frozen in place, trying to understand what had just happened. Why hadn't he escaped? It was then that I understood. He wasn't running away. He had looked at me just before he ran, not with fear, but with a kind of cold calculation, as if he was studying me. My skin bristled as I realized what was happening. The man wasn't leaving. He was waiting for his chance. I felt a knot in my stomach. This guy wasn't going to leave the house on his own. I was his target. I had to think fast. The cell phone was upstairs and the front door was a few steps away. But if I tried to unlock the door, he would appear out of nowhere and attack me. The back door was the best option, but that was the way he had gone. I heard footsteps. He was on the move. He wasn't running, he was walking slowly through the house, back and forth, but he wasn't getting any closer. It was as if he wanted to make sure I was still there, that I couldn't be sure if he was going to show up. My hands were shaking. I grabbed a floor lamp, the only thing I had nearby that I could use as an improvised weapon. I knew it wasn't going to do much, but I clung to it as if it was my only hope. I tried to reassure myself that my best option was the back door. If I could get there, I could escape. I walked slowly towards the kitchen, trying not to make a sound. My footsteps seemed louder than they were, but I couldn't stop. I had to get to that damn door before he found me. Just because he'd gone in that direction didn't mean he was still there anyway. I paced back and forth. Just as I was a few feet from the back door, I felt something pounce on me. I didn't see it coming, I just felt the impact. I fell hard to the ground. The air escaped my lungs and everything became confusing. This guy was on top of me, knife held high, ready to stab me. Instinctively, I reached up and grabbed him by the wrists, preventing the knife from coming down. I could feel his heavy breathing, his strength. It was clear he wasn't just a common thief. This guy knew what he was doing. He didn't have the slightest hesitation in trying to stick me with his knife. It felt like he had done it before. I, on the other hand, was desperate. I managed to push him far enough away to roll on the side, knocking him off of me. I jumped on him, using the full weight of my body to pin him down, punching him and trying to knock him unconscious. I didn't care where I hit him. I just wanted him to stop struggling. But then, from below, I felt his hands around my neck. The guy started choking me, his fingers closing tightly, cutting off my breathing. No matter how hard I hit him, I couldn't free myself from his grip. My blows became weaker and weaker, and everything started to become a blur. My lungs burned, and I thought that would be the end. With the last of my strength, I managed to turn my body and broke free from his grip. We both fell to the side. I coughed violently, trying to catch my breath, as he got up. He didn't give me time to react. He ran off into the darkness of the house without looking back. I wanted to chase him, but my legs were shaking and my body wasn't responding. I didn't want to catch him out of a sense of justice, adrenaline, or revenge. I was just afraid he was going to hide again and jump out and attack me. Luckily, I heard the sound of a window breaking, and then silence. I lay there, trembling, the knife still on the ground, a few meters away from where the fight had been. He was already gone. It was all over. I wanted to call the police, but first I stayed in that position for a while and began to cry. I sat on the floor for several minutes, still crying. When the power outage finally ended, the house was filled with light again, and I was finally able to calm down. I ran to my cell phone and called the police, telling them what had happened, and that I had recorded it, at least in my dining room. The thief had probably seen my cameras, but he didn't know that they were battery-operated, so they weren't affected by the power outage. The police spotted him and arrested him a few hours later. This man wasn't arrested because the camera recorded him, but because he was greedy. As soon as he was done with me, he went to rob another house a few miles away. I am so thankful that they caught him, because if they didn't, I was never going to be able to sleep in that house again. I was never going to be able to shake the idea that sooner or later, he would come back to finish what he started.
Sunnyvale was a quiet place. I remember when I was a kid, I wanted to have a job here. I felt that it was very safe and that it was a great place to settle down. And that's just what I did. I've always worked at P&G Jewelry since I was 20 years old. The routine was simple. Open the store, serve the customers, close, and go home. Day after day, the same routine. I was sure that I would never have any big surprises, that nothing would happen to me. but there was something I didn't take into account. There is no such thing as a completely quiet place. As long as people exist, evil will exist. It all started with small annoyances, details that perhaps anyone else would have overlooked. Strange people started showing up around the store. This was not a common occurrence in Sunnyvale, a place where you know almost everyone who lives around you. These individuals, always wearing hoods, would linger on the sidewalk across the street, watching the jewelry store. Sometimes one of them would approach, look in the window for several minutes, and then leave without saying a word. They weren't buying anything, they weren't even asking about prices, they just looked. At first, I took it as a coincidence. I thought maybe they were tourists or indecisive people. However, the frequency with which they appeared began to unsettle me. There was something about the way they looked, the way they moved, that gave me a bad feeling. I'm not a fearful person, but those guys gave me the creeps. Just in case, I called the police and told them everything that happened. I knew I was calling them for nothing and there was nothing they could do, but I did it just to let them know what was going on and to keep an eye out. They told me that it was happening in several stores in the area, but so far nothing had happened with them. The police told me that they would be watching the area and that if someone wanted to steal, they would stop them. I didn't doubt the cops' word, but neither they nor I knew what we were dealing with. The following Saturday, I arrived at the store early. That day, everything seemed normal. These people started coming in. Around 11 a.m., a customer I hadn't seen before came in. He was a burly man, wearing a black sweatshirt and a hoodie, even though it was warm inside the store. He walked slowly through the store, looking at the displays without saying a word. His hands were hidden in the pockets of his hoodie, and you could barely see his face under the hood. I asked him if I could help him with anything, but he just looked at me for a moment, saying nothing. I walked over to the phone and prepared to call the police. I did it as well so he would see me, so he would know to be careful. Finally, he came out without buying anything. It seems that I had scared him. At that moment, I felt like that was a victory. How innocent I was. A few hours later, I was closing the store to go to lunch. Just before I lowered the metal curtain, I saw a shadow move quickly across the street. I peeked out, but no one was there. I went to clean the entrance when suddenly I heard a clatter in the doorway. I didn't have time to react. In a matter of seconds, a crowd of people smashed the door of the jewelry store, and it was full of people, all wearing black hoodies and hoods covering their faces. They came in like an avalanche, armed with hammers and crowbars. One of them came up to me, pushed me against the wall, and yelled at me to stay still. I lay on the ground, completely terrified. I could only watch as they smashed the display cases, shattering the glass furiously. The jewelry, which I had always treated so carefully, flew through the air and was quickly picked up by those guys. It all happened in less than 3 minutes, but to me, it felt like an eternity. The sound of glass shattering, the chaos, the voices shouting orders, it was all jumbling around in my head as I tried not to lose control. In the middle of it all, one of them turned and stared at me. I couldn't see his face, but I felt his eyes on me as if he was marking me somehow. That man lunged at me and grabbed my watch and wallet, struggling with me and hitting me in the process. I put up no resistance. At that moment, I didn't care about any of my belongings or jewelry. I just feared for my life. Finally, just as they entered, they left. They left me there in the rubble of what had been my workplace for so many years. I didn't know what to do. My body was shaking and my mind couldn't process what had just happened. It was only a few minutes, but those minutes changed everything. When I was finally able to move, the first thing I did was call the police. I could barely articulate the words. I don't know how, but they managed to understand me and told me not to move, that they were close to me and that they would come immediately. As promised, the officers arrived quickly, although for me, not quickly enough. When they came in, I saw in their faces that they knew how serious the situation was. They asked me questions, but my head was elsewhere. I told them what had happened, how those guys had come in and razed everything. I mentioned to them the suspicious people I had seen in the previous days, the times they had entered the store without buying anything. They took me to the police station to formally take my statement. At that time, I was so dazed that everything seemed unreal to me. I was in a state of shock that I still couldn't get out of. While I was at the police station, the detectives reviewed the store's security cameras. The images clearly showed the robbers tearing the store apart, but none of their faces could be seen. The hoods and bandanas they were wearing covered them completely. Still, the cops said they were chasing some of the criminals who were escaping and that there were going to be arrests. That night, I could not sleep. I lay awake, eyes open, listening to every little noise in my house, waiting for something else to happen. My mind replayed the images of what I had experienced that afternoon. The hammering, the smashing of windows, those eyes that stared at me. I couldn't get that look out of my head. The next day, the police called me. They told me they had managed to apprehend 5 of the suspects. They had found them after a chase on Highway 101. During the getaway, they had thrown some of the stolen jewelry from the car, trying to get rid of the evidence. However, they still hadn't recovered all the loot, and many of the thieves were still at large. I wasn't happy about this. What if there was a payback? They had my wallet, now they knew where I lived? What was to stop them from coming after me? I started to notice hooded people appearing near my house. They were not the same faces, but their attitude was similar. Maybe they wanted revenge. Or maybe I was paranoid. A lot of people wear hoods. I tried to ignore it, convinced that I was going crazy. The media stopped covering the robbery after a couple of weeks. To them, it was just another case solved, another story to fill airtime. But for me, it wasn't over. The 5 suspects they caught were in jail, but not all the jewelry had been recovered, and other members of the gang were still at large. Worst of all, even after the news faded from public attention, the feeling of being stalked didn't go away. I no longer believe that mine is simple paranoia. Too many coincidences, and too many people walking around in hoods near my house and around the store. The only thing I still don't know is if they are intimidating me because of what happened. Maybe they want to rob me of the few jewels I recovered. Or maybe, just maybe they are afraid that I have identified one of them and they want to prevent me from denouncing them in the only way they can be completely calm. By killing me.